Hello to everyone joining. Welcome to our session on disability inclusive nature engagement. You can see there are 44 participants so far. Yeah, rapid.
Flooded in through the doors.
Yeah, must be very wide doors.
That's right. Well, they're all squashed and
Yeah.
together, and we need to call the fire brigade.
Yeah. In the interest of time, I might actually kick us off. I realize that some people might be trickling in. Some of you may have noticed in the chat that we have disabled the chat. This is not to stop you from asking questions. We really want your questions, but anything put in the chat tends to get read out by a screen reader, and that can be really distracting for anyone who is a screen reader user. So we have deactivated the chat, but if you would like to ask questions, there is a Q&A function. So do pop your questions in the Q&A and we'll hopefully come back to them towards the end of the session. If that's not accessible for you, we'll also have a chance for anyone to raise a digital hand towards the end. And the very whizzy organisers who are backstage will be able to enable you to then ask your question. So hopefully that will all work. So we've got about 45 minutes. We're going to do some really brief introductions to ourselves before reflecting on key opportunities across varied access domains for promoting disability inclusive nature engagement. And we'll end with some time for Q&A. So we'll start with introductions, and I might start by asking George, do you want to introduce yourself?
Sure thing. Hi, everybody. I'm George Rhodes. I wear many hats. So I'll just explain a little bit about me. I'm the digital accessibility lead at the University of Westminster. I also run an accessibility consultancy company called All Able. But the hat I'm wearing most today is probably my PhD hat. I'm currently working on my PhD focused on new ways of making tactile maps and diagrams for blind users, which I'll tell you a little bit more about shortly.
Brilliant. Thanks, George. And over to Andy.
Thank you, Sarah. I'm Andy Shipley. I'm mostly at the moment a researcher with the University of Exeter, working with Sarah on a project called Sensing Climate, which is looking at climate change, adaptation policy and practice, and the extent to which that is inclusive or exclusionary for disabled people, both in terms of development of those policies and practices and also the measures that follow from that. I'm also a nature connection practitioner specializing in nature immersion experiences, predominantly to do with encouraging and inviting people to spend a little time using the non-visual senses to discover more about the natural world, what our other senses have to teach us, and really realize that nature functions on many sensory levels other than just the visual.
Brilliant. Thank you. And I'm Sarah. I'm a health and disability geographer at the University of Exeter. Most of my research over the last 12, 13 years or so has explored experiences of health, well-being and disability with nature, interpreted in its broadest sense, from weather to the types of nature settings we might encounter, and more recently to climate crisis, climate change. So today we're going to draw on our various experiences to reflect on how to enable disability inclusive nature engagement across a diversity of priorities and interests. And I'm now going to try and share screen on some slides. Hopefully it will work if technology is in our favor. George, can you let me know, can you see slides there? Awesome.
Yep, can do.
Brilliant. So we've done our introductions. You've got hopefully a bit of a sense of who we are. So I'm going to kick us off. And I'd like to start with a quote from a sight-impaired participant who took part in an ESRC funded research project that ran from 2016 to 2018 called Sensing Nature, which worked with a range of sight-impaired collaborators to identify opportunities to unlock diverse sensory experiences in and with nature. And this particular participant said, I think nature has become more important to me in some ways now that I find it harder to get to it, because it's unnecessary that it's harder to get to. So it feels like an unnecessary separation. and an unfair separation. It's like it should be more important to get us out into the wilderness because we know that it's beneficial for health and happiness. So it should be more important that we get there, and yet you know that it's not. And that is really frustrating because I know that I will feel better when I get outside, but it's just difficult to get outside sometimes. And I've highlighted this quote really because it emphasizes that compromised access to nature is a social justice issue. It's an unfair separation. This isn't just a nice to have thing, it's important. So drawing on the Sensing Nature project and the work we've undertaken since, and the wide-ranging expertise of both Andy and George, in this talk, we're going to do a little bit of a whistle-stop tour of some of the key dimensions of access to be considered when seeking to enable disability-inclusive nature experiences, ranging from physical and sensory access to intellectual access and social access. So let's think about physical access. People often try to understand likely engagement with nature through measuring physical proximity to a space. But beyond proximity, it's important to understand whether people can physically reach the nature setting in question. If it's nearby, are there safe path networks to get there? If it's further afield, how can people get there, especially those without access to private transport? And if someone can get there, can they explore and experience the space fully? How is this supported by the physical fabric of the setting? Nature's often uneven, it's unpredictable, and it's changeable. And broadly, physical access demands attention to things like the ease of navigation, scale, layout, quality of path networks, site maintenance, and the presence and distribution of key facilities. But it's also worth recognizing that sometimes there's a lack of willingness to change the physical fabric of a setting, especially in historically or ecologically preserved or protected environments, and to think about at what point those protections actually come into tension with opportunities to maximize inclusion. Disability advocate and scholar Alison Kafer makes the important point that in many ways, the reluctance to make access adjustments reflects an act of ableist forgetting, a willingness to imprint steps, but not ramps, for example. So to read an extract from her work, she says, non-disabled access is made invisible, while disabled access is made hypervisible. Steps are themselves an accommodation, just one made for a different kind of body. Those who protest the development of accessible trails and services consistently use the language of protection in making their claims. In their view, increasing disability access and protecting the environment are irreconcilable, but the fact that it's often only disability access that comes under such interrogation suggests an act of ableist forgetting. That doesn't mean that every single trail will accommodate every single body. There will be terrain too rocky or too steep for some bodies and modalities. But this is true for all bodies, disabled and non-disabled. What shifts in this view is that trails are no longer designed for only one single body, and that decisions about trails are recognized as decisions, ones that can be changed, extended, modified. So there's lots more that I could say about that, but I'm mindful of time, so I'm going to move on to sensory access. And this is about if people can be physically present in a site, can they engage in a rich quality of sensory experiences in situ? Can they share those experiences with others? And what tools can we use to identify and unlock diverse sensory experiences and cues for navigating and enjoying a nature setting? Efforts to promote sensory access haven't always been fully thought through. And this is apparent, for example, in the context of sensory gardens. So whilst efforts to think about people's sensory experiences are really appreciated, a number of the participants who took part in the Sensing Nature project explained that the focus on sensory gardens as a sole access solution within much more expansive nature settings was often a missed opportunity. Sensory gardens often privilege quite passive forms of touch or hearing or smell, often at the expense of more expansive, exploratory, multisensory experiences that can nurture a sense of dimension, scale, orientation, spark curiosity, and support people to move and to move freely and safely in and with nature, catering for that kinesthetic sense. And many participants explained how being limited to short sensory trails or small sensory gardens inadvertently created segregated experiences, treating them first and foremost as people with impairment, rather than people with an interest in nature's varied forms and habitats, and closing down opportunities to explore, to develop new skills, to feel a sense of freedom, to share nature experiences fully with loved ones. And there are other examples out there that demonstrate different ways of doing this. So there's a photo on the screen there of Eifel National Park in Germany, and they have the Wild Way Kermit Trail, which is a 6.2 kilometer accessible trail. And it takes in a range of sensory rich environments right at the ecological heart of the park on the Kermit Ridge. And it has a barrier-free network of paths, boardwalks, panoramic views of the lakelands, wending through mixed woodland, regular benches, wheelchair-friendly picnic tables, interactive information stations with information in braille, audio. There's a tactile guidance system. So they've really tried to think about what can we do to make sure that people can enjoy the core of this place, not just a little garden on the edge of it, which I think is interesting. And another example on the screen here is a map called Potter and Ponder. And this was an initiative that was developed at National Trust Croom in Worcestershire. And this map was co-produced with children with learning difficulties from local schools and William Hinkham, an artist from Outside In, which is an organisation which provides a platform for artists who experience disabling barriers to the art world. And the map reflects these moments of sensory joy that unfolded across the parkland, as highlighted by the 35 children who took part. So teachers from the children's schools came along, and they used a variety of listening and communication tools and translation methods to try to ensure that children were clearly making their sensory choices through tracking things like smiles, eye movements, gestures, dwell time. And the artist then created illustrations to represent the selected moments. And so in this way, the children's experiences are now informing lots of people's experiences on site and guiding visitors to discover and share in those moments of sensory joy. And there are some really useful tools to draw on now to help identify and unlock sensory experiences and cues for navigating and enjoying a nature setting. And I'm going to hand over to George now to talk through a couple of those. So I will just let me know when you'd like me to change the slides, George.
Thank you very much. So yeah, slight departure, but still another way of looking at enabling access to spaces. So my particular focus with my work is on tactile maps, though I am starting to have more and more conversations with locations about sensory mapping as well. But I will mainly talk about the tactile maps for the next few minutes. This is another thing that is an interesting topic to get into. Many of you may have seen a variety of tactile maps out and about in the world when you start to think back. And natural spaces, country parks, various gardens and other outdoor areas are good opportunities to look at how we can make navigating those spaces more accessible for a range of users. But let me get into the meat of it a little bit, really. So what are tactile maps? If you haven't heard of these before, tactile maps are an alternative format that's it relies on the sense of touch instead of sight. They're often used by blind people for navigation or learning, and they can come in many different formats. There's about as many ways as you could think of to try and render a tactile map for somebody. So next slide, please, and I will show you just a few. If you're interested in any of these examples that are on the screen right now, because I've got a bit of a collage of them here, the slides should be shared, and I think in the notes of this slide, it's got a full list of all of the examples and where they're from. But what we've got on here is we've got a load of thermoformed maps, pedestal maps cast in bronze or other materials, various ones made out of plastic or wood, paper-based maps, even some other concrete cast or 3D printed ones. And this just shows how many different ways we can choose to try and represent spaces through tactile means. But the crux of my research lately has been there's actually a bit of a problem with getting access to these resources, not just for natural spaces, but in general. And the next slide, please, will tell us a little bit more about that. tactile format production has kind of died out in the UK. It feels like it was more prevalent several years ago, but as specialist creators have aged, retired, moved out of the industry, there has been a lack of replacement, a lack of more people getting into creating tactile formats. And so this is very much what my research is about, is how do we address this problem? Are there ways in which we can not only make the provision of tactile formats more available for people, but more accessible to new creators to get into without the needs for specialist hardware, loads of specialist software and training, because there's still very much a need for this this alternative, as was being spoken about just a second ago when we had the sensory access slides up. We want everyone to be able to experience the spaces as independently and as consistently as possible, not say that this is the only pathway that a blind user can go down, or they are restricted to certain areas because we don't have a way to enable them to learn and understand that space and to navigate independently. So the solution that I've been working on is looking at what 3D printing can do for us. The next slide, please, will show just one more kind of part of the challenge, actually, before I get into the 3D printing. Even for some of the other work that I've been doing with, for example, the National Archives, the reason why I think it's so important that we have tactile alternatives rather than just audio tours or audio descriptions for maps is how do you go about starting to describe such complex images? This here is a historical example of the survey following the Great Fire of London. There's so much context here. There's so many different ways we could talk through this map. Various information about the fire starting in Pudding Lane, moving west, talking about the scale of the destruction, and even when we're creating maps for navigation, how many different routes we might talk through, how many different aspects of the surrounding points of interest we may pick out. So what we need is a really good merger of different approaches, whether that is alternative text descriptions, audio tours, tactile or inclusive maps for people to understand the space holistically, not just be fed an individual route. So there's a wide array of interconnected areas with some of this. But let me talk about the 3D printing now on the next slide, and I'll show you some of what the research is yielding. So what I've done is I've developed a new method which, when released, should enable small creators, hobby creators. I've been working with schools and other small operators to create tactile maps with free software, with no 3D modeling knowledge required, just an understanding of drawing out basic graphics or basic maps, and through a very simple and free conversion process can turn this into what you can see on the screen here, which is an example of one of the outputs. So this is a floor plan for a house that I randomly picked off of Rightmove at some point, just as an example. So I don't know whose house this is, but they now have a tactile version of it somewhere. And as you can see, we can start to get really useful detail that very iconically represents that space. The stairs, all of the bathrooms, the beds, and in trialing these with blind users, I'm getting some really fantastic feedback that this is a very clear way to show all of this information in a way that is intrinsically understood without so much reliance on keys or abstract textures. So loads and loads of opportunity with this. I'm just starting to try out full color or multi-color tactile maps to be fully inclusive. But yes, this is a bit of a whistle-stop tour through the research. So if anyone is interested in tactile maps or 3D printing, do feel free to contact me as well, because I'm very happy to talk about this. And that's the end for my bit.
That's very cool. And you could get Andy and I talking about tactile maps for hours.
Mm. Mm.
And having just moved house as well, I'm very excited by this floor plan. But that leads us really nicely actually onto the next sort of domain of access, and that's intellectual access. So thinking about how the kind of the layouts, the stories, the histories, the ecologies of different sites and nature more broadly, how those are crafted and shared in inclusive ways, signaling that people with, you know, diverse sensory and communication priorities are welcome and part of a setting's wider story. And obviously this is perhaps most relevant in nature settings where there is budget, where investments are made into interpretation. Often that really boils down to kind of written text and interpretation boards. And although that's important, it's not always fully accessible. An over-reliance on the written word can really hinder full engagement. And there's lots of different ways of doing it, whether that is tactile information, large print, audio, QR codes, sign language, Makaton, and easy read widget. There's all sorts of things to consider here. And it's also about, you know, where is that information placed? And what obstacles might that create for people? How do that information, how does it weather in different seasons for someone to actually engage with it? And do the volunteers or the staff at these sites have the skills to share the site in an inclusive way? Are there some staff who've been trained in sighted guiding, in audio description, in sign language skills, for example? But it goes beyond that as well, because it's really important to think about who is shaping and designing and delivering the interpretation. We need to bring people whose experiences are seldom heard to the heart of the interpretation process. Because how is anyone supposed to manage or interpret an experience that they're not even aware of, because perhaps they don't tune into the place in that way? So the more people we have involved in that, the better. I think when considering disability in particular, there's a tendency to focus on visitor access, rooted in an aspiration to create an accessible experience for a disabled visitor. And that narrow framing really overlooks the role of disabled people as curators of experience, as potential site volunteers, storytellers, writers, communicators, education and visitor experience officers and managers. And I'm going to hand over to Andy now to talk a little bit about a project called Restoring Landscape for Social Inclusion that we did with Westonbirt through the pandemic, actually. So over to Andy.
Thank you, Sarah. Yes, so we partnered with Westonbirt National Arboretum, and there were a number of strands to the project actually, and the Sensing Nature walks were just one part. But the concept behind it was very much rooted in the thesis that visually impaired people have a particular experience of the world through non-visual means, and really creating the opportunity for visually impaired people to share that experience and enable visitors generally to the site to appreciate more about the Arboretum than perhaps they would have previously. So we commenced the project in 2021, recruiting a cohort of 4 visually impaired guys to work with the existing volunteer walk leader team at Westonbirt. Prior to that, we had done some work training the members of the guides, the Westonbirt walk leaders, in sighted guide training and a little bit of audio description, but also Sarah and I put in quite a lot of work revising the existing training materials that Westonbirt uses for its volunteer walk leaders, very much classroom-based material, using lots of PowerPoint slides and technical information relating to the trees on site. So there's a great deal of transcription of that material into more accessible formats, so that they're more usable for the visually impaired walk leaders, but also encouraging the volunteers there to perhaps move outside with the training program as well, and to enable their trainee walk leaders to immerse themselves in the nature that exists at the Arboretum, and if you like get up close and personal with the very trees that they would be describing during the walks. So that was a significant really evolution of the training program that volunteer guides were taken through, which was, as I say, reconfigured for the training of visually impaired guides, but I think is something that's persisted since the development of the Sensing Nature Walks program. Anyway, so we managed to we recruited 4 visually impaired guides. I think we have some pictures of them. Sarah, do we there on screen?
We do. We've got Louise and Mark on the left-hand picture, and Louise's guide dog Axel, and then we have Louise and Axel and Mark with the lovely Liz and Martin in the other picture.
Oh, okay. Okay. So yeah, as I say, we recruited 4 volunteer VI guides. And they were paired up with, as you've seen by the pictures, team leaders from the volunteer walk leading community on the site. Excuse me. And they really developed their own program of guided walks over a number of months, just focusing on aspects of the Arboretum that they felt that they wanted to tell the story about in a more multi-sensory way. And it took, I think there was a degree of learning from both sides, both in relation to the visually impaired recruits on how to take ownership of the walks that they wanted to lead and not be steered perhaps by the Western-Burt model, and one that's often can be quite technical, I think, in relation to the history of the trees and the collection as a whole, and the way that the trees were acquired in the first place, towards towards a focus that was much more about the visually impaired walk leaders and the aspects and facets of the trees and the locations that they wanted to describe in relation to how they, as visually impaired people, were experiencing them, and those elements that they wanted to share by participants on the walks. And I think there's a degree, as I say, a degree of evolution really that was achieved, I think, just to move us to a place where the visually impaired participants were able to really become walk leaders in their own right, with essential supports being provided. So the tradition is that walk leaders would also take responsibility for risk assessment and oversight of the, say, any health and safety of the groups that they were leading. And our slight modification there was that, or that they would be responsible for the walk. There would always be a sighted assistant accompanying them, just to take responsibility for those other aspects, as I say, that the more the health and safety and risk assessment side of things, and enable the VI leaders just to be able to focus on delivering their walks and highlighting the features that they wanted to draw people's attention to. So they began their first program of walks in autumn 2021. So I think Western-Burt describe the Arboretum in autumn as their firework display, don't they, Sarah?
I think so.
And the colours that really are displayed by the trees are a real, they're a real attraction, and it's probably one of the times of the year when the Arboretum is most at its most busy. But the kind of features that the VI leaders were bringing out were, textures and the fragrances as well that were present at the Arboretum at that time, and moving away from the visual depiction of the tree collection, and just much more about bringing people's awareness to, as I say, those other aspects and the relationships between different trees and some of the surrounding wildlife as well. It's very much a process of conveying the fact that nature is, works on a systemic way, and trees aren't artifacts that just sit in a landscape. They're also hosts to a wide array of life, and there's the interconnectedness of that between the tree and its setting, and the life that it attracts is very much at the heart of this more multi-sensory approach to leading the sensory walks that took place at Westonbirt. Since then, the walks have continued throughout, well, every year since then. There are a number of I think they're currently in the process of seeking to appoint some more visually impaired walk leaders. Louise, who you saw there with Axel, is also I think about to take on the role as a team leader as well. So she's becoming a member of the standard, a leader of the standard walks as well, and not just the sensing nature walks. You may have even seen that the sensing nature walks have been featured on BBC TV in an episode of Country File early last year, I think, if I recall correctly. Yes, it's just going on from strength to strength. We have some quotes from one of the walk participants. I think, Sarah, you've got that there, haven't you?
Oh no, that's not not on the slide anymore. But
oh, is it not?
No,
No, I've
sorry.
realised I've just tried finding it and I can't. Well, I've got some tech
That's all right.
problems
I knew time would be tight, so I took some of the quotes
Yeah, and I
out.
can't actually access the quotes here either.
There is a link to a little booklet on the screen there, and there's lots of quotes and lots of background to this initiative in that booklet as well, so people can hopefully access that too.
Oh, hang on, I've got some here actually.
We might need to move along soon.
Okay. Please do. Yeah.
Only so that people have time for questions.
Absolutely, yeah. So
but yeah,
and just like to invite you, if you have time, to pop up to Westonbirt next spring and participate in one of the walks. They're run on Fridays every week throughout the season, so spring, summer, autumn, and then close down for the winter.
Brilliant. Thanks, Andy. There's I think we could probably talk about that project for many hours too. And it just really rolls us into the final access domain that we were going to talk about, which is the social, and just thinking about why efforts to broaden the stories that are told about a site and who's telling them are really important from a social access perspective. And in part, it's about ensuring that settings support a diverse range of activities, and that activity programs organised in these settings are open to all and supportive of varied interests and priorities. It's also about addressing the lack of diversity within the environmental sector, creating a culture of inclusion across varied embodiments and social identities in the organisations involved in managing, interpreting and sustaining varied nature settings, celebrating diversity in how settings are and have been managed. And this may well involve acknowledging some contested or hidden histories and their impacts on who feels part of a site's story or otherwise. And that's something we explored as part of our AHRC-funded Unlocking Landscapes network. And again, there's a little link to a booklet on the screen there that tells you more about that if it's of interest. But when thinking about social access, it's essential to support the sharing of diverse stories about nature, what it is, and the many different ways in which it is or could be experienced. As noted by scholar Arthur Frank, people not only think about stories, far more consequentially, people think with stories. And being able to share and understand these stories fosters belonging and connection. And the more we address identity-limiting norms, practices, and stories that shape how nature access is understood, enabled, or closed down, the more likely it is that embodied and social diversity across a range of nature settings will become both common and unremarkable, rather than exceptional or unusual. So just to wrap up, we just wanted to flag that, access reaches far beyond concerns about proximity, being present, having a ramp or a handrail, although they are important. We need to think and work creatively across these different domains of access, and to consider how to embed sensory, social and cultural diversity in the stories shared about and the experiences supported in and with nature. And we cannot emphasize enough the importance of collaboration and partnerships in doing this, in making those unseen or rarely felt qualities of nature experience more compelling across varied backgrounds, histories and life circumstances. And you can find out more about many of the things we've talked about through the links on the screen there. But we have 10 minutes, so I'm just going to stop the screen share because I can see that little Q&As have been popping up whilst we've been talking, which is really cool. Let me see. There's one from Victoria who writes, thanks for all this. This might not be your area of expertise, but I work for a local environmental record centre and so regularly make maps to show habitats, statutory site types, e.g. nature reserves, heat maps to show species diversity, so displaying lots of information on a single map. We've struggled to not rely solely on conveying information through colour alone and find it difficult to give meaningful alt text to describe, for example, a strange shaped site boundary with complex habitat information. Any suggestions on how we can make more accessible maps without oversimplifying valuable information would be great. Thank you. I feel like this is one for maybe George to kick us off with.
Right.
Sorry, which one was that? I was just responding to another one
Oh,
in the text. Sorry,
that's
yeah.
right. It's the top one by Victoria. So how to kind of make more accessible maps that bring in all these different types of information without oversimplifying it.
I did read that one. Yeah, there's a lot of challenges to that. So I've had similar problems with kind of heat maps and stuff from the Met Office, who obviously do a lot of kind of weatherfront stuff. When we had that conversation, they were wondering, well, how do we describe all of this weather stuff with alt text instead of the visual maps? And then we kind of reminded everyone that already happens because people read out the weather forecast on the radio, which is, you know, a purely audio format that would kind of work for an alt text description there. I've been doing some other stuff with a PhD student about crime statistics maps, and they've generated some heat maps that they couldn't see because this student is completely blind. And we have done some tactile heat maps instead. So all of that kind of overlay layer, that contextual layer kind of comes out of the map. You may have seen similar kind of ones in the past. People do that quite a lot. But it is definitely a challenge for heat maps and other bits of business intelligence information. We have this conversation quite a lot about people using Power BI to kind of show heat maps and other information. So I don't have a panacea answer at the moment, but really whenever we sort of get stuck with this, we revert back to trying to better understand the audience, who's after this stuff, what adjustments can we put in place that will best serve the majority of that audience for now, and then if we need to do you know, a tactile alternative for an individual person, we are quite happy to do that. But yeah, sorry, no panacea answer, unfortunately.
That's great. Andy, is there anything you want to come in on?
No, not really. It's not in my wheelhouse, that tactile. Other than I think, and this is probably as much for George, is no, I won't take up the time actually. I think it'd be better to hear the other questions. Yeah.
Okay. So there's another question. Something's popped up on here that I'm not sure what it means. Anyway, I'll just continue with the questions. From someone saying it's great to see lots of initiatives to get more people with disabilities enjoying the countryside and the great outdoors. Unfortunately, they tend to focus on people with more obvious health conditions. Do you know of any initiatives to help people with energy limiting conditions, ME, chronic fatigue, vaccine injury, long COVID, etc., who may need to rest more frequently? They may also have a greater need for toilet facilities along the routes. So I could say something about this, but I don't know if George or Andy want to come in.
I don't know of any initiatives, but it's certainly something where kind of done physical space reviews and kind of walkthroughs with country parks before, looking at regular stopping points, making sure that there is regular seating available, that the seating is accessible as well, because quite a lot of the time, you know, you see park benches and stuff outside. If you know, people are going to struggle to get a leg over on those park benches, or you know, if they don't have enough of a lip, so a wheelchair user can at least approach from one end front on, so they always have to kind of turn to the side. There's a lot that we kind of flag when we're having those conversations, but yeah, no initiatives I'm aware of, but definitely something that whenever I have those conversations, the regularity and the accessibility of any seating available is one of the front and center things as we do our walk round.
Yeah, just to come in on that, and there is guidance on that. There's a British Standard 8300, which sets out guidance for design of an inclusive external environment, and it picks up those very points that George was just talking to around design of seating, variety of seating options, frequency, distances between, that sort of thing. So, I mean, if that's helpful generally in creating just a more inclusive external environment for a wider range of needs, then I'd certainly recommend looking that up. But in terms of specific initiatives, yeah, particular locations, nothing comes to mind immediately.
I do have one suggestion for the second part of that question, which was about a greater need for toilet facilities. Accessible toilets, often a challenge. Many of you may have access to a radar key. Some of you may not know what a radar key is, but it's the kind of universal key for a number of accessible toilets in the UK. But an initiative for that is pushing to get more toilet facilities in is the Changing Places initiative. So they do kind of like self-enclosed toilet and changing facilities, and they you know, set these up. I've seen them in a number of places, and they have a, you know, full-sized adjustable changing facility with hoist. They've got a you know, fully accessible toilet there, and washing facilities and everything as well. So they're a really good initiative that I would highlight if people haven't heard of them before.
That's great. And I think one of the things, so a different strand of the work we did at Westonbirt was with 6 disabled artists who came on site to respond to the site through a kind of artistic process. And 2 of those highlighted in particular that it's great to have an accessible toilet or, you know, accessible facilities or a space with seating, but in a site as massive as Westonbirt, you also need to think about the distribution of where those things are, because otherwise you can't really go in and explore a site if then you're going to be too far away from an accessible bathroom or seating, or so that came through quite strongly. But yeah, great question. We've got 2 minutes. So I'll do one more that we might have to answer at speed. There's somebody has said, love the 3D printing for tactile maps. Such a great idea. I'm curious about costs though. Who prints them and how much would you charge for printing if it's you that prints them? Having worked with 3D printers in the past, I know how expensive they are in terms of initial costs, materials, maintenance, and time.
So that's a good question. That was the one I was typing out an answer to, but thought I'll answer it here instead. It's still comparatively a cost-effective option. So the reason why I'm interested in 3D printing is if you look at buying like a traditional brailer, the massive 3D printer I've got here, and I've got like 3 3D printers now. The massive one I've got in the corner, that was still cheaper than just buying the noise-reducing hood for a traditional brailer. So comparative, or even like dynamic braille displays, you look at like the new Monarch that's come out, that's 15 grand. My large printer was less than £1,000. So there are definitely some comparators between the other methods for prospective creators who might get into standard brailing, if you like. There are some consumable costs, but normally in terms of raw parts, it's maybe £10 or less for some of the sort of portable sized maps that I'm printing. For larger ones that take many plates, it might be a bit bigger, but those are normally going to be more one-off displays that lots of people are going to interact with, so you offset that cost a little bit. It's definitely a cost-effective thing to think about. The other reason why I wanted to focus on 3D printing is because there's a lot more prevalence of 3D printers in places like universities, colleges, and some schools now, or even just hobby creators or other independent print shops. Whereas finding someone with a brailer is a much more niche thing to locate. So even though there may be some cost arguments, just the availability might be slightly better. So yeah, it's good question.
Thanks, George. And that's perfectly wrapped us up to time. So there's lots more questions there. Please do email us if you haven't had your question answered and you'd like to come back. But I've been given strict instructions not to run over. So a huge thank you to everyone for coming. And I hope that you really enjoy the rest of the conference. And yeah, just get in touch if we can be of help. So thank you. That's goodbye from us.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye.